should be live on the stream. What's
up,
Internet?
Hello.
How are y'all doing?
Oh, well as we can.
Yeah, I picked an apt background, kind of dug through the Google images really quick.
Topical.
Only because it's so hot, not for any other horrifying.
Yes, no other
reason.
It's just. Are you? How hot is it where you are? Because it's not quite a butt yet here, but we're edging towards it.
Yeah, it'll be in the mid 90s today, which is Florida standard. It's supposed to get a little bit rough, but I know there's places in the country where it's above 100. So
yeah,
I'm gonna complain for my own sake, but understand. And
yeah, where a lot of people are about to learn what a wet bulb temperature is on the East Coast.
Yeah.
Well, Ethan, you have kind of the opposite. I kind of like the theme here. We have sort of fire and water dueling backgrounds.
Nautical adventures, life on the high seas. There's nothing quite like being on a boat on the waters.
Yeah, I have to say, I've been on a boat a few times in my life, mostly with a nautical friend who's from Maine and grew up boating. But we watch a lot of Below Deck because it is, to me, the least bad, most entertaining of those kind of Bravo like working person reality shows about people serving rich people. They're all upstairs, downstairs, like dark enlightenment, situations. But it's interesting to see big boats. To me, Ethan, I agree. It's like just interesting to see big boats do big boat stuff. Where it's like, how do they stop? How do they go? How does the food get on them? Where do people poop? Like, those are the questions I want to know, and I feel like I've been answered thanks to Bravo. So with that, why don't we get into some drawing? So y'all, do y'all want to talk about what you were going to draw today? And I know, Tony, we briefly talked about this kind of idea of diegesis and, what does it mean to make art from the world of the game as opposed to from the third person perspective, not in the game. And I think, Ethan, you have many thoughts on this as well. So I'm gonna mostly not talk this one, just kind of toggle back and forth on your screens.
Yeah,
good idea.
Go ahead, Ethan.
Oh, no, that's just agreeing.
Yeah, it's something that, especially with Blister Critters, and then I guess even more so with the project that me and Wythe have kind of been working on in the background, is just the concept of, for me, trying to figure out how I'm going to make artwork for like a role-playing game, or just, I guess, games in general, because Yoink Point included. How do I make the artwork, and then subsequently the layout and the font choices and the color choices, and then everything that kind of cascades from there? How do I make that all feel like a cohesive product? So like with the game that we're working on in the background, Pistols and Pajamas, one of the big things I want to accomplish with that is for it to feel like a 19th century like children's book, and there's such a rich kind of library of stuff to pull from. But not even just like stylistically with how I'm going to illustrate it. Like I want, insofar as I want to source paper that feels kind of like sturdy book paper, and I want to have like a gold, like embossed cover and like a fabric binding to it. And I guess the question being like, how important is that to me as an artist, and then how does that translate to players, insofar as it evokes the emotion of, oh, I'm looking at kind of a faux children's book from the 19th century. Here's how that'll inform how I interact with the artwork, how I interact with the mechanics, how I feel while I'm playing it. And so as it relates to Blister Critters, I really strive to make the artwork colorful and really dynamic and goofy, to hopefully get people on board with the kind of style of play that I like to encourage with it. But obviously that changes game to game, where Stillfleet has a very organic, kind of kinetic illustration from Ethan. And I don't know how much, Ethan, you've considered that in between Sometimes Kingdom and the Stillfleet stuff that you've worked on.
Oh yeah, the with Stillfleet, the sort of like brief that I cooked up and working with Wythe on it, is, to me, for Stillfleet specifically, you know, on one hand, it's very literal. It's sort of like taking a specific period of early modernism and then jamming it in with a certain kind of like, diesel tech isn't quite the right word because it's like super duper future, but there's you know, a litany of artists specifically from the 1980s who were really dedicated to thinking about the nature of super future, and it's a really special time period because they were very limited by the technology of the time. So you wind up having these gorgeous oil paintings and you know, flat colors with like spot renderings, and like they were thinking about printing and they were thinking about like physical materials. So all of that stuff winds up having this very textural feel to it, and that's kind of what I wanted to bring to a lot of it, like the sort of intersection of like the weird kind of flatness of early modern art, but then also like the very textural, like handsomeness of like early modern period garb and objects, but like this very sort of like super post-future, like ramshackle, almost kind of rotting feel to a lot of it. And then once that was done, sort of like crash that into, because like the late Tefnian is sort of like the last gasp of this like ultra advanced society in Stillfleet, and that was all you know, super bright colored and geometric and nanotechnological, and sort of taking all of that moody texturalism that's like kind of 80s inflected and crashing it against that like really geometric feeling. And so that was sort of like the idea that I cooked up for there. I don't think it's super successful all of the time. I think sometimes the colors get a little bit muddy, but to be fair, there was the start of a pandemic going on when we were working on it.
Yeah, there was also like, it was a new thing for us because Ethan, you've done a lot of art, I've done a lot of GMing and writing, but we'd never made at the time one really big book, and then later a bunch of follow-on products for a kind of product line together. And it was interesting doing it with Tony a second time, you know, and having that experience of like Tony pitching us Blister Critters and having a specific idea in mind, and we'd sort of gone through the ringer of like developing a book and other products, and now we're doing it a third time with Danse Macabre and a fourth time with SK. So it's sort of like, I don't know if it gets easier for y'all in terms of the actual art, the actual drawing, because each is kind of a unique puzzle, but maybe even just the project management hopefully gets easier. So I think with Stillfleet, it was the most naive. Like, I don't know, Ethan, can you draw 300 things like
I can
really
draw
quickly?
300 things, no problem. I draw 300 things every month. Like,
yeah. So what are y'all drawing today? And do you want to say a little about how that relates to diegesis?
Yeah. So for me, this is actually it is, I think that like my experience on Stillfleet, to Tony's point, like has definitely affected the way that I sort of start attacking art at the beginning. And there's stuff that I've sort of changed, and there's stuff that I've kind of gone back to trusting myself a little bit about. For diegesis, for in world design for SK, it's funny because I really like Wythe, the idea of it like a unique puzzle solve. I feel like that's a really great way to think about art and design, even like the meta of designing a product or like a thing that's got lots of art in it. I think it's a really great way to frame thinking that's very positive, because you don't always successfully solve a puzzle the first time. Sometimes you've got to try and try and try and try. And it's not the worst thing in the world, because it's like, oh, it's still fun to try to solve a puzzle. And then you feel really great when it's out in the world, because you're like, look at this fucking awesome puzzle that I solved. In terms of designing SK and its look, I think part of it was like like I really like doing retro future, and I like doing mashups of different styles and cultures. It sort of is my intellectual happy place. For SK, I really kind of wanted to bring it back to like my love of marginalia and doodling, which covers like a whole lot of different time periods, because it's a human art that's been around since as long as we've like had something in a substrate to fucking graffiti. But there are specific time periods for it, I think, that really sort of like influence more the look and feel that I want. And one of those is like a couple of like specific eras of medieval art, and then some specific eras of 17th and 19th century art. And then also just sort of like my own like art scribblings as a kid. I kind of wanted to bring all of it in-house and then like have a world that justifies what it looks like. So in some ways it's kind of going backwards. Right now I'm doing a nautical encounter, a monstrosity that one would find on ship on the sea. Nautical mechanics, you've got to spend a few days getting between the islands of Seasons Keep, which is the setting of SK, the Sunset Kingdom. So I thought it would be fun to have a sort of a nautical monstrosity that you might not fight directly unless players want to. It's more just like after 3 days you encounter, this Fisher King, or I guess it would be fun. It would be King Fisher because it's not a person. He's got a special MacGuffin chalice that he wants to give you, or something along those lines. But it's like if players then want to be like, no, we want to fight this fucker, roll to combat. It's like, okay, here are the stats for the guy. So I'm doing that same kind of mashup of like eras. I'm doing like this is a kind of like, I'm so happy, by the way, guys. My arm is feeling better now. I've been dealing with like chronic arm inflammation and like a tennis elbow for like 3 months now, and I've been doing acupuncture, and I'm finally able to like get back to doing my scribbling. Oh, my sweet scribbling! I love you so much, Scribble. But I'm trying to like do that marriage of a kind of like child's doodling with a very specific kind of like pencil work from a long ago era. And this fish is just directly lifted from memories of like, I don't know if it was like a print of Jonah and the whale, or if it was just your general 13th century sea monster. But like the eye that I'm giving him is just like, it's, straight up Mega Man.
Yeah, that's yeah. I mean, it's clearly could be a little bit diegetic, but it doesn't seem like you're trying to be completely medieval or early modern as much as use some of that reference in terms of the size of things, the sort of realism of like fish with teeth, which of course now we know fish had teeth for millions of years, but not not when people were drawing these drawings in the late medieval and early modern. Tony, do you have thoughts on your sort of current art and relation to your own question here about like, is this realistic or not? And to me, your art is it reads clearly, but it doesn't look realistic in that it's clearly based in this cartoon world when it comes to Blister Critters. So I'm wondering how you think about. But then again, for you, it's a cartoon world, so I guess it is realistic to that world, right? It's kind of that same loop, but a little different from the games Ethan's been leading art-wise, where like the world is more. The physics are normal physics with cutout breaks, right? With magic. Whereas in a cartoon world, it's a cartoon.
It's definitely like a balance. Like I think right now I'm probably drawing one of the more absurd like beasts, just basically just kind of like doodling while we're talking. Just putting together probably a quirkier, probably less like violent or threatening like mutant to find in Blister Critters. But there is a certain aspect of, I think I touched on it maybe the last time we briefly talked when I came in, where in the core rule book, a lot of the beasts have a way of like having more anatomical correctness, even though they're all clearly very cartoony. For whatever reason, I focused on making the so like here I'm making the legs kind of be more dog-like, where they have like multiple joints. Where I think if I was making like a critter or a friendlier like animal for the world, I'd probably just make them more tubey and not so like angular. Even down to the way I do the claws for the claws, the paws, and that kind of thing. The teeth, especially. Like I think if he was like a nicer guy, he'd probably just have like a rounder mouth, and like strangely human teeth. That might actually make it a bit scarier, but
this beast goes to a dentist when you draw it like that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's almost scary that there's a living dentist fixing him up.
He's like a yassified monster. He's just real. He's real handsome.
But I think one of the things for Blister Critters, when I'm trying to differentiate and relate that kind of information without directly saying it, I think that the beasts and the more nefarious, I guess, animals tend to have more animalistic features, harder edges, more anatomically correct, albeit cartoony, like biology. And then the hero critters, or the nice animals, I guess. To put it as simply as possible, are generally softer or have kind of like spaghetti arms or noodle limbs. There's a better word for them. It's not coming to mind right away, but
yeah, like symbolic rather than representational features or something. Yeah, that makes total sense. I never thought of that, Tony, in looking at your art for a good amount of time. So that's interesting to sort of hear that that there's a sort of simple rule behind some of those choices when you're designing critters, PCs and NPCs who aren't generally quote unquote bad guys versus beasts, who are almost always, there's encounters of some kind, there's a threat, even if they're not just evil or something, right? They're very complex. You have that whole beast sort of generator zine. So yeah, no, it's cool to think about those kind of rules of thumb and how that relates to, I guess, like realism versus, in your case, different kinds of cartooniness, I guess, different kinds of simplification that we expect in cartoons. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and there's definitely like I can see it between the work that I did for the first book and the work that I'm doing now. I think some of the references that I'm pulling from are a little bit different. Like the second book, or I guess like the second wave of products outside of just the core rulebook, have a way stronger like Ed and Eddie, like almost directly. I've been looking at a lot of like the backgrounds and the line quality from like stills from the show. They just give everything a much more dynamic and like bouncy, loose feel. Where a lot of the first book is much more like structured, and the line work is much more intentional. And I'm really happy with all of the artwork in the first book, but I'm enjoying the energy. To me, and I guess back to kind of the original thing I was posing, is like, how can I make the artwork evoke the emotion or evoke the vibe that I want people to get in on. And so I think with a lighter, less constructed illustration style for BC moving forward, I can get closer to what I want people to get out of it. And that comes coupled with, like layout choices and like different font choices, colors as well.
Yeah, so maybe also that's something, Ethan, that's something interesting to think about, like your own art evolving or making very deliberate choices where there's kind of eras of like, the different, I always think of comic books, they bring in different artists for the same character. So you're seeing like, Frank Miller's Batman and Paul Pope's Batman are very, very different, but they're both like iconic. And, you could do that yourself, right? You can have simplified beasts that are still scary, but you're doing different moves to get them to scariness. And I don't know, Ethan, if you have thoughts on kind of how you design monsters, and here we have this more sort of behemoth-like, not just a big fish, but yeah.
For right now, I'm just sort of going for scale. It is interesting thinking about monsters because diegetically in the Sometimes Kingdom, I wouldn't say that it goes like in full Star Trek mode of like IDIC, like infinite diversity, different combinations, and full tolerance, and utopian ideals. But like one of the conceits is this idea that like the former antagonists of human folk, of humankind, like skeletons and giants, and they've all sort of reached parity with human folk because it's now in quotes the modern era, and it's sort of very cagey about like it kind of is sort of like, because it operates on like fantasy logic and almost in some places fairy tale logic. So it's like, it's probably most likely the 20th century, and it's probably like towards the end of it, maybe. So like, with that comes this idea of like, oh, there's cars when they steal them, and there's some technology, they're very suspicious of it, but like, and magic is reacting very weird to technology. But in terms of antagonists, sort of like, well, if you can't instantly identify what an antagonist is, because a skeleton always kind of looks angry, like, it really just winds up being like you have to engage with a creature ahead of time. You have to like figure out like, art thou friend or foe? So really then wind up like, what are the things that make something dangerous enough to be like a real beastie or like a real like a combat encounter? It's like, well, they have something that you want, or they're just like a fully lost or malicious entity, or they're greedy. Corruption winds up being this like, I feel like much more interesting framework for creating a villain, because it's a little bit more like, I mean, I do love a scene chewing evil villain. I love them. Like, I love them because of the kitsch value of them. But like, I feel like that winds up being like, there's the line from Adventure Time where he's accusing the Lich King of being so evil that he's boring. And I feel like I've tried to take pains with this game to like, if you'd encounter this like behemoth, like this kingfisher up on the water, like looking at the drawing, you'd be like, is he evil? Is he just really tired? Is he put upon? Does he care about me? Like, is he angry? Like, there's this, there's a lot of like potentially negative emotions just being telegraphed from this creature. but like it doesn't necessarily, from its facial expression, like immediately want to devour you. It's not like this mad creature who is hungry. So trying to telegraph stuff like that with facial expressions winds up being like really important to me.
Yeah, and maybe that's that'll be interesting to see over time as SK develops, where you net out with some of those tensions between, you know, what is a monster in a world where everything is kind of alive and magical, and we're trying to make it a little less D&D-ish, where there's like bad or evil bioessential creatures, and then also with the sort of marginalia and trying to have the book look really appealing, and also kind of like Ethan's mind, you know, this kind of sketchbook, and where that, you know, that tension resolves in terms of like highly finished art and like set pieces versus things being sketchy, which, you know, D&D has made a whole brand around actually with monsters, where a lot of the monster art is intentionally sketchy for them. In contrast to, they spend tons of money on, you know, gorgeous full color,
fully rendered,
you know, main book illustrations up to the bestiary parts. So it's interesting how that's like, it's not necessarily good or bad, or, you know, it's really just like a design choice. And to Tony, you mentioned this earlier, like it involves layout choices, it involves color, you know, it's not just like how the artist is drawing one monster or something. So yeah, I don't know, y'all have other thoughts on diegesis and art and land and sea monsters? I see we have a theme going where Ethan's drawing a sea monster, Tony's drawing a land monster. Really feel like we've got something brewing.
For anyone listening, there was an NT discussion in a recent meeting talking about seems there are very strong feelings in the group about the glory, the objectively fantastic world that is nautical adventure in games and ship mechanics. So I am approaching that right now, and I do appreciate that, Tony, you have steadfastly gone with fire, the hated element, against water.
Yeah, so to state my opinion very clearly, if you need a boat to get somewhere, you don't need to be there. If you need a plane to get somewhere, you're not meant to be there. I thought about it a little bit, and I thought, well, like trade wouldn't necessarily be as it is, and you know, maybe there would be some suffering for it. I'm fine with that, but then also just make the boats automatic, and like, yeah, maybe we couldn't have done that up until maybe a decade ago, and then at that point, that's fine. We could have just gone all that time. People could have figured it out. Logistically, will it have worked historically? I don't know. That's for smarter people than me. I'm just the one with the ideas. But you know what's funny is I hadn't really considered it until now, but there is like it's an explicit, but also it's kind of hidden in a lot of the BC text, like a disdain for fish that is somewhat unfounded and just kind of a byproduct of the way the game was built. We just kind of left them out. But also there was a point where I was like, no, let's make it like a thing where like fish aren't a part of the game. They're not mentioned. You can't find them necessarily. And so I wonder if I have something a little bit more subconscious or serious going on, where the ocean maybe scares me in a way that I'm not willing to.
Yeah. Can we do some trauma stuff here? Were you like bitten by a fish, Tony? Is that? I mean, you're
from
I've
never had
your dad, like
coastal area, I guess, right? But you didn't grow up in the maritime trades.
No, I've never had any real issues with fish until now, and I think like secondary to that, I think there's a lot of stuff like that in BC that are kind of I don't know, even the way that I'm doing the beasts now is just very spur of the moment, intentionally kind of improvised goofiness that I'm like, nope, that's the choice I've made. That is what I'm sticking to. And in a lot of ways, it works out to be kind of idiosyncratic in a way. But then in other ways, I'm like, well, so pointedly, I think the fish is like a funny thing that maybe we'll revisit. Maybe it'll always be a rule that never gets adjusted. But a rule that I made for myself, and tying it back in, I guess, to the artwork and the way the process. The first book, I had a really steadfast rule about the way that I wanted to color everything, where everything in the foreground has like the pink and yellow gradient to it, and then everything in the background is like the blue and green gradient. And it wasn't until we were coming up on, or I was coming up on finishing the artwork and the layout and the development for it, where I started to blend the two. And then once it was finished, we had it printed, and I was doing, I guess, supplementary work for future products and future development. I started just using the colors less as hard gradients and more as like a paint palette to pick from. Um, and now I'm like, man, this looks great. I don't know why I gave myself this silly rule that I felt so strongly about. I think it gives it a very distinct style, and makes it recognizable. The hard rule, but now I look back and I'm like, man, I could have been a little bit more open minded with the way that I was kind of approaching it.
Well,
And I
that
think,
goes back to evolution, right? That you guys choose things as artists and then later choose different things, and that's not a flaw; it's a feature, right? It's you're allowed to do that. It's your art
yeah,
for one, and for two,
Yeah.
these games can evolve. They don't have to be static, where like BC is only ever one thing, Stillfleet's only ever one thing. So
It can be challenged, especially like because you like as it sometimes starts as an exercise, sometimes it starts with like, because art takes a lot of stamina. And it's like sometimes I think you wind up choosing rules, and it is very easy to get very dogmatic about those rules. Because it's done so much work. You've seen the proof is in it. It's what you like, it's your happy place, or it's just getting the project done. And then maybe when it's time emotionally to shift it, there can be some growing pains. Um, because you're like, well, I've been doing it this way. I wanna why change way do? Why change way do? Gonna keep doing way. But like there's something calling to you that you're just like, yeah, I think it's gotta be this other thing now.
yeah,
yeah.
and yeah,
I
go ahead.
think especially with the way I think a different like focus, a different thesis for the way I want to go about some of the artwork now. There is I think now with a fuller palette, it almost somehow reads more like stills from a cartoon than I think it did
Hmm.
in the core book. I'm also not. It's not just the color changes. I'm also shading things differently. I'm not as about. It's a weird blend in the first book of being like kind of realistically shaded, but super cartoonish in its like shape language and in the way that everything kind of like moves. But then when I would go to shade stuff or I'd go to like fully render it out, I'd be way more worried about having it look like obviously not hyper realistic, but just more realistic. Where now with the newer way that I'm going about it, um, I'm like more intentionally using kind of like flatter patches of color with like minimal shading, trying to in some ways consider like would an artist that's on the kind of time budget that animators typically are realistically spend a whole lot of time shading this in or rendering this out where it would just probably be a big circle or it'd be kind of like a really smooth gradient that uh, doesn't have like a ton of like rendering on the fur or a ton of like wood grain on some of the stuff that I did the first time around. And I think
Hmm.
that has been a change that I'm really happy with.
Getting back to the idea of diegesis, I feel like the challenge that I set up for myself with the Sometimes Kingdom specifically is that it is a fantasy world um, that operates more on sort of collage rules or bricolage rules, where it is a pastiche of like fantasy tropes and a pastiche of different time periods from actual like grounded time periods. But like it is more related to the art of those time periods, like, and that art is, obviously grounded in history. It was made at specific times for specific reasons by specific people. Um, but like the challenge that I really wanted to set for myself was sort of like diegetically, like everything in the world. There was like a big disaster that happened like hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe thousands of years ago. It happened a long time ago, and since then they've rearranged their society around the seasons. So each island has its own season. So like that's already a great hook for organizing like design stuff, because it's like those
Mm-hmm.
are very stark differences in color and dress and garb, and like thinking about the cultures that would develop over 1,000 years, based on that stuff and the tensions that would arise from that. Stylistically for me, like across the whole product or across the whole book, I like want to sort of try and make it clear that they're still kind of like taping things together from different eras. So like trying to have this sort of sketchy stuff, like, you know, it's a prominent it's a prominent iconography, it's a prominent style from like a lot of different time periods. And the thing that I'd like to try pushing forward, like as the game develops and as the book develops, is to sort of like maybe up the collage factor of stuff. To maybe it may make it even more like overt. It's like, okay, yeah, the questing network has been around for thousands of years, like their archives have archives, like, but now there's new monstrosities appearing. Magic is different than it used to be. But like we've got a bestiary like of, you know, this particular kind of fish. Like if this is specifically a bestiary entry and it's sort of taped together from like a bunch of different eras, like I think for me, I'm still struggling with, well, struggling is the wrong word. I think the challenge that I'm setting for myself is like this kind of sketch is like, I love doing this. I could do this all day. And in fact, I do. Um, but I really want to start upping the collage factor of it and start crashing some syncretic styles that go well together or like dovetail together into the same drawing even, or into the same space. And the book does that to a certain extent already. That like all the marginalia is filled with like marginalia that looks like it's from the medieval era and from like a high schooler's notebook. But I really do want to keep upping like the different eras that are smushed in place and maybe making them a little bit more front and center.
On your end, I imagine that having like in the same product that many differing kind of like styles and assumed like different modes of, like, you have to be in a different place in my mind to do something that is like, you know, really well rendered out, and then doing something that is just kind of like a high schooler doodle. I enjoy when I have projects that let me kind of span like multiple styles. So I imagine that it's kind of, you have you can have your cake and eat it too, in a way where you're like, I don't really want to work on these overly rendered bits. I can kind of just figure out some of the more fun marginalia that have to be done, so I get to kind of switch modes for a bit.
Oh yeah, totally. And I mean, when we were putting together the early access rulebook for release, which you can find on Twitch on stillfleet.com and various other locations, pay what you want. You should play it and run it. We're running monthly games on Weird Wednesdays. Um, you know, I think that like there was a period of time where it's like, okay, it's feeling a little bare. I said there was going to be marginalia, doing a page count, and it's like, oh, that's got to be like about between 1 and 200 little widgies. And so it became this really fun process of like, I basically went through and I ransacked my old sketchbooks. I did a bunch of new stuff too, but in trying to like think about it, it's like, well, there's a bunch of errors to my own art too. I've got decent scans of a bunch of it, and the rest of it I've got in boxes. So like, I really went through. I included a couple of my high school drawings, which I painstakingly saved after graduating, and I like some stuff after moving to New York. So I kind of just sort of like dumped it all in there to try and get that feeling, because my style's changed over decades. And then it also winds up being this sort of fun, a little bit wistful, meaningful kind of process and product. Kind of like merge everything together. And I think in the future, I'll probably maybe set up like artificial distances between them. And to your point, Tony, yeah, it is absolutely that. It's just like, well, crap, I don't want to keep working on this house. Like,
Yeah.
Time to make a sword doodle.
Yeah, no, I feel super similarly. Like one of the other really large projects that I work on, not with the team, is like a bunch of like Mad Borgy zombie stuff. And the style that I've kind of found and done with all of that is way more realistic, way more kind of like hyper violent and, you know, gnarly zombie stuff. And so that's always a nice reprieve from doing the, I don't know, the cartoon animal stuff, which I also really enjoy. But being able to have like this really wide kind of, I don't know, chasm between the two lets me I don't know, try a bunch of different stuff out. And then with the stuff that I've kind of been doodling on and off for kind of our weird frontier dreamland thing, I'm also trying to kind of expand, I think, my comfort zone slightly, and like figure out between all the various styles that I'm trying to evoke of that time, how can I modernize it? How can I still have fun doing it? And so I guess that's some of it too. When you're trying to have this kind of collage feel, and you're trying to evoke very specifically like this kind of artwork or this style or this time, how I don't know, how much emphasis are you putting, or how much pressure are you putting on yourself to be like, I want to make sure that this is like period accurate so that it evokes this specific time, or how much of it you're like, well, as long as it evokes the feeling, I don't care if the line weights and the line work and the colors aren't accurate to that style.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think for me, I don't put too much pressure. I feel like one of my I think my big special
Ethan,
interest
sorry,
is.
can you zoom in? You're zoomed way out.
Oh, sure, yeah. I was just
Yeah.
I didn't realize I was back on the screen.
Unless you don't want to be showing, I just was switching back and
I
forth.
think I got caught up in the shape of it was getting a little too horizontal for me. I wanted to make sure that like this guy's head kind of felt out of proportion with his tail. Still kind of working on that actually. I'm not super jazzed about that shape language in the back. I got really excited as to like the back height of his fins, and so it wound up being like a little bit busy. So I'm trying to figure out the best place to sort of like land it. There we go. Yeah, I think that I don't like one of my special interests is art history. So there are certain, and like because I like sort of like, I think inhabiting the minds of like, artists of long past. Sounds really affrontatious when I say it out loud, but it's true. I don't put too much pressure on myself specifically with this project. I think to like land at specific time periods. I think I've got a working map in my head of like where stuff is what, and it might be something really fun to start mapping out and giving to players too. In my mind, for instance, like Interheart and Ignite, the winter island in Seasons Keep is much more wedded to like story-wise like the procedural because it's got some of the only really dense urban cities in the world, and so it like harkens back to Gothic novels because it's really spooky there. So that's a very specific kind of like fantasy so it started being like I'm like okay, this is where the 19th century lives. It lives in Interheart. So I feel like that's when I start being like, oh, I've got to start being mindful of that if I really want to keep to that brief. Because like the 19th century is also globally like this immense, amount of change and stuff. So I could either go one direction and be like, okay, this is specifically the 1890s at the dawn of like mechanized print, like in a very specific area. Or I can be like, nah, I think I kind of just like, I know the kind of line work. I know what like sort of like evokes it. It's kind of vibey. And then Springside is like a little bit more in quotes medieval or fairy tale. So that's like an easy lift because a part of it just winds up being like what shape languages from a bunch of different eras or like what line weights sort of like generally evoke that idea. So if somebody's interested in it, they're like, oh yeah, I kind of get what you're laying down.
Yeah.
Versus like this is going to be from 1905, because that is a very specific time period, like when a certain kind of fairy was drawn. Maybe eventually I'd like to get to doing that specifically, but for now it's mostly like I'm trying to figure out, I think the visual language that's unique and specific to sometimes Kingdom and Seasons Keep, because diegetically that's probably going to be how they glue all of their stuff together to help adventurers out.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Like I think on my end is I think specifically for it's really early in its like development and me and Wythe kind of figuring out the vibe for Pistols and Pajamas, but I think on almost on the flip of what you're saying, I think for myself I want to like almost train myself or practice to have it almost be deceptive or be so good that people open it up and they're like, oh, like this looks like old, if that makes sense. And something about that, I think tying back into the puzzle aspect of it is like figuring out how I can make this book look like a children's book from like 100 years ago, over 100 or almost 200 years ago, and like figuring out again, I keep bringing it up, but like specific like font choices, and then as it relates to layout, they weren't making tabletop games I don't think, at least not in the ways that we are now. And so, like, what does a table of like junk look like in that case? What does, keeping it interesting? Because frankly, in some of the research I've done, the layout is really boring, but like that's kind of some of the layout. I will say that there are a handful of artists that I found or I've been like, oh, this is like really wacky. This is like, and at the time it was seen as such, as like kind of bombastic and outlandish. But a lot of it's just like full justified, like one column on a page, and you have the title of the chapter at the top, and that's it. And so like I don't want to make a game book like that necessarily. So for Pistols and Pajamas, it is kind of like a puzzle of trying to figure out how can I make this book look and feel from top to bottom like something from like 200 years ago, but also have it feel like refreshing and modern and like a fun spin on
I can say a little bit, because I also think it's important to note, like, just that, the art has evolved so much, especially obviously with InDesign and Photoshop and, now Affinity and Canva. But like the frontispieces, if you look all the way back to the beginning of typeset books, the frontispieces are where really people spend a bunch of time, basically the credits and the page opposite, which you often had a portrait of the author in an eschaton in the European tradition. And like, a lot of that stuff is like, and then you get jokes like Tristram Shandy is making fun of a famous, the life and opinions of Carl Gustavus, the King of Sweden, who had this bombastic, biography. And then, Stern is like making fun of that. And so not only at the level of text, but like the way the book is presented. So even that's like 1700, right? Is like mocking graphic design. So it's not that it didn't exist. And it's not that people didn't play a sort of tabletop games, but obviously, there was no industry. There weren't luxury goods that were commodities that most workers could afford. So it just, it's apples and oranges, but there are these threads, because that's something I've looked into for some other projects and just sort of in general. And it's fun to think about that also at the level of writing. Like, when are you trying to write? It's similar to drawing, like you're saying, like when are you trying to make it sound like a specific person or era, and how much does that matter versus a general vibe? Because sometimes the specificity is good, sometimes it's bad if it's like someone who sucks, like, and most people sucked in that sense, politically. And not to like, be anachronistic and like pointlessly judgy about people 300, 500 years ago, but like, you don't want to import the negative. But then there are, there are these figures who are really amazing, and you're like, okay, I mean, Thomas Paine all day, Stern, whatever. You can find sort of these counter figures in any setting, in any time period. So I think it's kind of interesting to think about when you want to be historically specific, when you don't, and how that affects not just art, but as you're saying, graphic design and also writing. I think in all three cases, they all have to make sense together to make a good product that at the level of the consumer, you don't think about any of that too much. It's just like, oh, this game is dope. It looks dope. It's fun. It makes sense. It's easy to read. It's doing whatever it's setting out to do. So I like that all three of us, it seems like, have kind of spent a lot of time, thinking about those things.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said also for like, I think the intellectual work of not only reproducing a specific era, which is a good and awesome thing to try and do, but to also like, getting into that mode of like artistic license, because it's like seeing where some of their failures were, like just straight up objectively, like design wise, and being like, I bet this is, I mean, I always think about like the line from Futurama where it's like they're watching an opera and Bender goes like, well, I don't recall ever fighting Godzilla, but that's totally what I would have done there. That I think applies to design a lot of stuff where it's sort of like filling in gaps and making in quotes improvements to sort of have it be ported into our era for readability, for visual interest, and sort of also just for creativity.
Yeah, I'm definitely approaching that specific project from kind of a self-imposed like puzzle, where like I really want to commit to those things and see them through. But then to your point, Ethan, find ways to update them and have them be true to the time, even if like flipped or modernized or like updated in a way that maybe they didn't have access to, or that weren't they didn't really need a big table for combat or for exploring the area. So what would that have looked like?
Well, also, I think there's something to be said for Tony, the idea of doing things as zines first, as opposed to big projects or one-page games. And I think we've all struggled for various reasons with, like, I just personally don't love the limitations of 1 or 2-page games, but I think moving to making smaller products faster does allow us to have some of that, breaking down of some of the assumptions of, like, well, the bigger books have these development cycles that are longer and more set styles, and the smaller books in theory should allow us to kind of interrupt ourselves and try out stuff, and then we can always adopt it, or it can push the bigger book in a direction. And you've, even with BC, to your point, like with Blister Critters, you had a big push and everything was one way in your head, and then doing one smaller project, you've already experimented and decided to, in some ways, simplify, in other ways open yourselves up to other colors. And I think Ethan, I think we'll see that as we take SK from that initial push to get this right. You can get the free or pay what you want version right now, the early access version. But as we move toward a first physical, just like zine quick start, maybe that's a time to revisit. So really, it's a question, how might you revisit,
Totally.
basically given space limitations and the fact that we really have to cram a lot in, right? It's a little guy, so you don't have as much art, so you have to be kind of mindful. And what does that mean? So I think with each of these projects, like the actual aside from art, writing, and design, there's also like product design, like the things where we're printing a thing actually matters, right?
No, I mean 100%. Like figuring out this the small scale of only having to do like 30 to 50 pages. I think definitely changes the way. It takes a lot of the pressure off. Like in the same, it's almost like just doing like a thumbnail or like doing like a small sketch before you do like the full piece. So in a lot of ways, um, I am happier that we're starting to do uh, more of the zines before we hop into the larger projects. Um, Even for the BC zines, they've also kind of like shifted and messed around, and a lot of it too is that prior to BC, I hadn't really laid out like a full book in that way. So even while I was making it, I was like learning how to do stuff, and I mean I still am. Um, like in a lot of ways I'm confident in my ability to draw and to illustrate and that kind of thing, but the layout is something that I'm always like with everything that I do at this point. I feel like I'm always advancing and getting better with every project. So having like a broader docket of zines that are kind of on my plate feels good, and that I know I have a lot of like practice, I guess, coming up to continually like evolve and find better shortcuts, find more efficient ways to get stuff done, but also ways to explore and to be more outlandish when with time permitted, and project based. Like for Danse Macabre, things are much more constrained in the way that we're trying to lay things out. I think rightfully so. I think it matches the vibe and what we're trying to go for, and having it all feel like illuminated manuscripts. The ornamentation and that kind of stuff can be really uh, not wacky, but just much more ornate and expressive. But the layout itself, it kind of only makes sense for it to be 2 column with some full page artwork on one side, and sometimes having a piece of ornamentation at the end of a chapter, or very rarely kind of splicing it into the artwork. um, I think there's a lot to be said for being able to have all of those different things going on, especially from the company. People that are coming to the studio, and they have so many different, I guess, like options to choose from in terms of what they get out of each one, I think is important too.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe Ethan, I'm curious about your thoughts on that too. Like, just giving also as artists, y'all, some ability to do different things or have different products in development or different ways of making art, while asking that there is some continuity, so that Blister Critters and SK and all of them don't change product to product so much where someone is like, what is this, right? Like, it's indie, but it's not, in a weird way. While we're maximalist, we're also somewhat traditionalist, and that we like those kind of old school D&D, like, you get the set and it makes sense, you know what I mean? And we've talked about those things.
Yeah.
So it's like there's that, it's, I always go back to different, Deleuze, like difference and repetition. Like, what do we change and what are we keeping the same when we have these discussions around, okay, we're gonna do a little new thing, so I don't know if you know how that sort of impacts your thoughts at the birth of a new game, but to you it's an old work stream, and that you've been drawing these things in this fantasy world for years, right? As I take it.
Yeah. It's sort of totally it's same but different. Which is in some ways it's very product friendly. So I feel like just to push it a little bit, trying to sort of like get to the edge of that, of being like, okay, well, if we are staying true to a certain tradition of it, sort of like, what are the most out there examples or the most sumptuous artistic examples of that tradition, to start drawing from. And it's funny because it's like, I think I've talked about this before. Wythe and I, we've talked about this both on camera and off. Like, I didn't play Dungeons and Dragons growing up. I played it a little bit in the late 90s, and it didn't go great. So I stopped playing for about 20 years until the pandemic. But I always there used to be bookstores. I mean, mercifully, they're coming back again. Like, I used to just sit there as a teenager, in a Borders Books and Music or a Barnes and Noble, or my friend Ian or Mike's basement, and I just would read through all of their manuals. And so I've got these grounded memories of certain time periods and certain affects from that period, but I never actually played them. I was only really interested in the ancillary media. Like, I didn't play every single video game, but I always like looking through like the how-to manuals or like the walkthroughs, because then like you let the sort of the narrative of going through something wash over you. Um, in terms of like gaming, it's nice to have that vocabulary, but there's also tons of stuff. Like, I'm glad that we've got, for instance, an internal library, and we're always talking about this stuff, because like in terms of the traditions of game art, there's a lot of stuff that I don't know. Like, my knowledge comes from a very specific kind of art history and it's comprehensive, but it does not include that stuff. So it's always exciting to be like, oh crap, just when you think you've learned it all, there's like a whole new world of weird grognard art yet to be discovered. I think that that's super duper fun. In terms of being continuous across product lines or difference between them, I really like the kind of like challenge of that stuff, because like, you think you know how to draw people or a fish or a desk or an action scene or a landscape, but then inhabiting a different style to keep it on point for a different product means sort of thinking differently about the thing that you thought that you already knew. And that's a really interesting product process, because you wind up learning even more about the thing that you thought was stable.
Yeah, I mean, even on my end, I didn't grow up playing like tabletop games. It's really not until the past 4 years. I mean, I really haven't been playing, and I don't have like this long history of like growing up and loving tabletop and that kind of thing. And then even insofar as like my artwork being used for tabletop stuff is really new for me as well. And so I think in some ways I have this I don't know. Sometimes I feel like it's a detriment, and that I don't have this like long history, or I'm that like well versed, I guess, in not just tabletop games mechanically, but like what is expected, what are the things that people look for, how are tables normally set up, how are things like this normally built. But then I think that there is a certain amount of like, well, because I don't know, it's easy to have it look like a thing that I did, and as opposed to kind of biting on other styles, or um, feeling constrained to illustrate in a way that I don't know, reads as tabletopy, which in a lot of ways I think is more so just to say it doesn't look like it came from Wizards of the Coast.
Right, and their house style has so gelled at this point. It's cool to see. I mean, some of the art is just absolutely tremendous, but it is also like, because it's gelled so much now with their attempt at consistency, that it's sort of like, well, let's take a look at their past history and past artists who've worked for them, and then it also opens up this other space for something a little bit grindier and gnarlier, like trying to soak up that energy I think that we all like from playing these games, that is not present in the art at this current time anymore.
Yeah. So this is great. This conversation is great. It could go on forever. Final thoughts, maybe Ethan, do you want to close this out with any final thoughts on any of these topics, and then we'll probably call it a day.
Sounds good to me. Yeah, overall I think making stuff that feels diegetic for a world can come from different ends. You can start with a style and wrap a world around that style, but in doing so it might wind up changing your conception of the world in that style as you go. Or you can also start with an idea and then see what kind of styles wind up diegetically making that world shine.
Love it. Tony, do you have any quick final thoughts? Do you feel like we addressed, some of these topics we're seeing? And just to summarize, we're seeing some cool art from both vaguely the Blister Critters universe, but maybe also Pistols and Pajamas. And we're seeing awesome stuff from Ethan for Sometimes Kingdom RPG. But yeah, Tony, any last thoughts here before we close out?
No, I enjoy rambling. And I'm glad I got to ramble with you two today about artwork and that kind of thing. Hopefully we can hang out and ramble again.
Yeah, we'll do it again. Hopefully this is useful, just set time for us to work, and hopefully folks will, discover the stream. So please tell your friends, your followers, and anyone who watches and enjoys it, tell folks that this is just a bi-weekly workshop where we're doing work anyway. So might as well, share the old Photoshoppy if that's of interest, and folks can always ask questions of, two, or at least one, often two or more, working artists. So thanks so much, Anthony Grasso and Ethan Gouldini, as ever, host of Livedrawing Livestream with the Stillfleet Studio. Yeah, that's it. I'm going to click end stream.
Peace. Later.